The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 6. Sub Persona Infantis. Chapter 2. The Disappearance of the Spectator. Should there be players and livers, art and life, or only one thing? That is one way of putting the matter, not perhaps the best, but one that brings out one aspect of it. The magnificent spirit of experiment animating the Moscow theater is a byword, and when the usual stage performance elsewhere in Europe is recalled, except, of course, those of Germany, the intellectual deadness of the life outside these two countries must at once be apparent. But art is as yet, no doubt, too much politics in Russia. And the politics being in too elementary a stage, the art associated with it must not be taken too much au pied de la lettre. Russia is still in the phase, where such things as the tone of the press and so forth are concerned, of heavy courtship and flattery. Mr. Michael Farbman writes as follows on the subject of the Bolshevik revolutionary jargon. It may, after all, be no paradox to say that this party, yesterday the party of most extreme revolution, is today becoming, in a sense, a conservative party. This statement may be difficult to believe, especially as the phraseology used by the leaders has changed very little. But words generally retain their currency longer than the ideas they stand for, and, on the other hand, the more conservative the Bolsheviks become, the readier they are to adhere to the revolutionary jargon. I personally am so convinced that there is an air of deliberate overstrain in their use of this jargon that when I read leading articles in their press proclaiming the primitive ardor of their revolutionary principles, I am sure that they are protesting too much, and that the party is probably preparing to make another step backwards. After all, this sort of duplicity is part of the stock and trade of the politician in every country. Bearing in mind this necessarily artificial, revolutionary, proletarian background, this by no means involving a fundamental insincerity on the part of the group compelled, in the nature of things, for the moment, to such conventions and expedients, we shall be able to place, better than otherwise we should, the particular art manifestations that are its reflection on the Russian stage, and in which the confusion of the actor and the spectator is carried deliberately to its logical conclusion. I will quote from a review, Labor Monthly, April 1925, on a book of Mr. Carter's on dramatic art in the Workers' Republic. His, Myrhold's, aim, we are told, is to find the best means of conveying the spectator into the creative author in such a way that he experiences all that the creative author has experienced. But the link that connects this idea with Myrhold's method is missing. He seeks, we are told, to put the spirit of life on the stage, and the production therefore should be simple, highly concentrated, and abstract. The spirit of today he believes to be the machine spirit. Society is a moral machine, the actor is an essential part of the machine, with movements to correspond. But how this is expressed by ladders and levels, bare walls and spirals, actors that are disciplined and uniformed like an army, is not here explained. The new theater of Russia aims at emphasizing a collective personality rather than an individual one, at expressing masses not men. Chekhov's studies of introspective individuals are out of fashion. The worker, the trader, and the peasant of the new theater do not represent any particular person whose character interested the author, but represent their class or their profession. With this simplification goes an attempt to break down the barrier between the audience and the actor. Reinhardt had tried this, but in England the influence of the Gordon Craig school had been in the other direction. They sought to make the actor more remote, masking him, robbing him of personality, so that he should seem isolated, a creature of a different birth. The literary theatrical tradition has for the moment partly broken down in Russia. The new school of producers will take any liberty they choose with the text, and are more concerned with the action and emotional sweep of the drama than with the dialogue. This, however, is possibly only a phase of development, at an era when plays suitable to the temper of the new audience are hard to come by, and at a time when quick methods are imperative if they are to find enough material to keep the theaters open. The lack of sympathetic plays also accounts for the growth of theaters where improvisation replaces the written word, an amusing reversion to the commedia dell'arte. So we see the simultaneous disappearance of the author and of the actor, to all intents and purposes. The people go into the theater as though into a large nursery, and improvise their own plays, dividing the relish amongst themselves, or this is the tendency. The policy of such of the theatrical world as remains from the old regime is to break down the barrier between the audience and the actor, to express masses not men, not to represent any particular person, but a class type, the trader, the peasant, the bad man, and the good man. Out of all this new, fluid material, the material of folk art, poured into the theater, new forms are certain to take shape. But at the moment it is as art a willfully created chaos. The Ethylontai are in art what the barbarians are in politics. These conditions occur periodically, or are apt to, but as a dogma the theory of the amateur is valueless. If the professional is a bad professional, that means the society that has produced him is a bad society. Apart from the social snobbery which is invariably, in England and America, at all events, at the bottom of the cult of the amateur, a society that begins abusing its professional artists, its royal academicians, etc., is generally at fault itself. The Royal Academy in England is a perfect justification for social revolution. It is the inevitable counterpart of the 19th century industrial slum. The amateur as a dogma is meaningless. As a destructive expedient it has more meaning, but only if it aims at the stage at which everybody is capering about, smudging pieces of paper, cutting stones and kneading clay, bellowing in every room, and scribbling couplets on every wall. Any criticism of a genuinely imagined utopia would no doubt be improper. But we have today, among the wealthy, a small-scale cultural democratic utopia flourishing around us. It is impossible not to draw certain conclusions from having it constantly under our eyes. And they must awaken certain misgivings in the most ecstatic breast as to the possibilities of every man his own artist succeeding, any more than every man his own doctor is a great success. The ideology of progress, again, so admirably exposed by George Sorel, is also in some part responsible for the cult of the amateur. Condorcet's delusion on the subject of education is dealt with in the following way by Sorel. Condorcet hoped, he writes, that public education would result in all magical superstitions disappearing, no longer to be the dupe, he says, of those popular delusions and errors which torment people with superstitious fears and chimerical hopes, to defend oneself against prejudice with the independent power of the reason, finally, to escape from the glamour of charlataneries laying their traps for our fortune, our health, our liberty of thought and conscience, under the pretext of enriching, healing, or saving us. These words of Condorcet's, as Sorel points out, provide themselves the evidence of a grave delusion and superstition on the part of their author. It is doubtful, is Sorel's comment, if the sort of instruction that is given to the people is of a nature to preserve it from these follies. It is impossible to foresee what a skillful vulgarization of occultism by the great press might accomplish. I n'ai pas ridicule de supposer que nous apprenons en ces matières de découverte capitalis. Popular education, at all events, has only resulted in people being infinitely more gullible. It is the most remarkable instrument of deception so far invented. The know-all, the je sais tout system is the best to keep people in complete ignorance of everything that profoundly matters to them. Today there is no political, scientific, or other charlatanry that cannot be put across them. This power of imposition and suggestion, put to good uses, and in the hands of people desiring the good of the mass, would be a marvelous instrument indeed. The cult of the amateur, then, can be regarded on that side as part of the humbug of progress. Yet you must guard yourself, however clearly you see the vanity or the simple trickery of that idea, from a gesture of discouragement that could affect the poor man struggling to obtain some of that culture which, owing to the circumstances of his life, has been denied him. The passion for learning that is often found in the working man's club is a far more rare and impressive thing than what is generally the professional learning of the don, or expensively trained specialist. In an adverse analysis of the cult of the amateur it is very important not to disturb some of the permanent institutions of amateurism, which are more valuable than most of their professional counterparts. Any obstruction placed in the way of a poor man, longing to bathe himself in music, mesmerize himself with pictures, or drug himself with books, would be a very different thing to prohibition. The question lies altogether in a doubt as to whether sociological thought is not apt to tread mistaken paradises, and especially whether it does not persistently tend to mistake the function of art and culture, to neglect the nature of its biologic limitations, within certain rigid psychological cadres, and to overlook its dependence on certain set conditions. The catharsis effected by the Greek stage is a stock picture of its satisfactory functioning. If the actor ceased to act, and lived as acting, he would then be purging himself. He would soon cease, if he acted or lived at any considerable pitch of emotion, either to act or live any more. The only way in which he could perform the same tragic and purgatorial parts would be by watering down his vitality very much, and regarding his art much less seriously. That must inevitably be what happens when life takes over the tasks of art, and when as a form of living the many aspire to practice what can only be a ritual and artifice of a highly trained few. So a utopia is not necessarily an active utopia. Quiescence, obedience, and receptivity are required for action, as well as the active factors, just as women and men are required to produce a child. Is not the woman usually referred to most flatteringly today as the creator, the repository of the creative function, the really important partner in the sex arrangement, the man the mere executant? So to be receptive rather than active, to just lie down and cover rather than execute, is by no means a humiliating role. And the spectator's godlike riddle is not a contemptible one at all. The term friend of man would not hustle him into action, or excite him to express his personality. The people show that popular education has not deprived them of every vestige of common sense, in paying little attention to the incessant newspaper jibes about their going in vast crowds to watch, merely, football matches and other expert displays. Since they could not do it so well themselves, they much prefer to see other men, highly trained cracks and champions, doing it for them. Also they enjoy being the spectator and availing themselves of his privileges, detachment, and passivity, also his greater mental satisfactions. Use not the gallery of a theater to be referred to as the gods? The theorist of amateurism, the person who wishes to compel or persuade these people no longer to enjoy vicariously but to be their own this and that, is not serving them well. In another place I have dealt more fully with this question of the amateur, or the return of the Ethylontai, and this brief summary must suffice to bring the present argument into line with the wider thesis of this essay.